Our team with new reporting here and new images of the daring U.S. military raid to capture and extract Nicolás Maduro and his wife.
What began like a familiar ICE or FBI takedown, built on precision, silence, and synchronized teams, was in fact aimed at the very center of power in Venezuela, a place usually protected by layers of security and political distance. At just after 4 in the morning, while most American cities were still dark and quiet, a coordinated operation was already unfolding far beyond U.S. streets, moving with the same discipline and timing seen in major federal raids at home. Multiple U.S. agencies acted together, not in chaos or haste, but with calm control, executing steps that had been rehearsed and refined long before the first aircraft moved. Nothing about this moment was spontaneous, because the events that unfolded before dawn in Caracas were the final phase of months of quiet pressure, intelligence gathering, and strategic positioning. Subscribe to Military Power, because what surfaced in those early hours may mark the beginning of a far larger confrontation still taking shape. The operation that unfolded was not an invasion, and it did not resemble a traditional act of war, because no armored columns crossed borders. No massed infantry moved through Venezuelan streets under banners or public declarations. What took place followed the logic of high-level gang arrests carried out by federal teams inside the United States, where silence, deception, and timing replace open force, and where the goal is control rather than domination. At 10:46 p.m. Eastern Time on January 2nd, a final authorization was given, and from that instant, the operation moved forward without public warning or visible escalation. The mission focused on removing one individual from the center of power without collapsing state institutions or provoking a nationwide military reaction. Every element was carefully crafted to avoid the appearance of invasion, occupation, or conquest, and to resemble a precise seizure executed within a narrow time frame. For months before that night, intelligence officers worked quietly, following routines with the patients common in long-running gang investigations, where weeks of observation often lead to only minutes of usable opportunity. Movement patterns were recorded across days and nights, security habits were logged, and small changes in behavior were studied with care. The priority was not predicting conflict, but finding stillness, a moment when habit replaced caution and the target remained in one location longer than usual. These windows were rare and fragile, and when they appeared, they often closed quickly. When confirmation arrived that the moment had opened, hesitation was removed from the process because delay increased the risk of exposure. Unlike a military invasion, there was no attempt to flood Caracas with troops or dominate neighborhoods through visible presence. No checkpoints appeared, no armored vehicles rolled through public streets, and no formations were displayed to intimidate civilians. The design mirrored domestic arrest operations against cartel leaders, where overwhelming force exists nearby, but remains unseen unless resistance forces it forward. This restraint reduced panic among civilians and lowered the risk of spontaneous clashes with regular military units who might react based on incomplete information. As the operation entered its active phase, Delta Force elements moved into position with discipline shaped by years of urban raids and counterterrorism missions. Their approach relied on surprise and speed rather than numbers, with teams assigned precise tasks and strict time limits. Each operator knew the sequence of movements in detail because hesitation in confined spaces spreads confusion faster than gunfire. The plan required that the initial entry and control phase be completed within minutes, as time itself represented the most significant threat. The breach unfolded with controlled movement and minimal noise as access points were secured and interior corridors were taken under control. Security personnel encountered during entry were isolated through positioning and speed, not prolonged exchanges. The focus remained on containment, preventing alarms or signals that could draw outside forces toward the location. This phase resembled the opening moments of high-risk warrant service in American cities, where speed denies targets the chance to organize resistance. Inside the compound, tension shifted into controlled urgency. Teams moved through rooms methodically, maintaining awareness of every doorway and hallway. The objective was not to clear the structure completely, but to reach the individual at the center of the plan before confusion spread. Family presence had been anticipated, and procedures emphasized the use of restraint alongside firm authority. Within moments, the primary individual and his spouse were physically secured, removing uncertainty from the situation. Throughout the operation, the absence of large-scale combat was deliberate. Heavy weapons were avoided, and visible shows of force were limited. This choice reduced the likelihood that nearby units would react aggressively based on fragments of information. By the time external security elements could begin to understand what was happening, the critical phase had already ended. As extraction preparations began, the tempo shifted toward withdrawal. Routes were pre-planned to minimize exposure, and timing calculations ensured the team would not remain longer than necessary. The movement away from the objective was swift and organized, reflecting the discipline typically seen in domestic manhunts, where a prolonged presence increases the danger. The transition from control to departure occurred seamlessly, leaving little opportunity for interference. The significance of this approach lies in what it avoided as much as what it achieved. There was no seizure of government buildings, no declaration of authority over territory, and no attempt to dismantle institutions by force. Leadership alone was targeted, removing the head of the system while leaving the broader structure temporarily intact. This reflected a strategic preference for decapitation rather than conquest, allowing leverage without immediate chaos. As news of the capture surfaced hours later, the contrast between perception and reality became clear. What appeared sudden to the outside world was the culmination of a process that had been unfolding quietly for months. The operation ended before large-scale responses could be organized, denying adversaries the time needed to react. This was not a battle measured by ground taken, but by minutes controlled and reactions denied. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments, as this method raises questions about authority, security, and potential future conflicts. Yet this precise seizure did not stand alone, because it was only possible after sustained pressure applied beyond the city, where American naval forces quietly shaped the conditions that made such a rapid operation achievable. The air phase of the operation did not aim to dominate the skies or destroy an enemy air force, because its purpose was narrower and more dangerous. The goal was to carve a brief opening, a thin corridor of confusion, just long enough for helicopters to pass through without being seen or challenged. This method resembles the way law enforcement helicopters support high-risk gang arrests in American cities, where the aircraft does not stay overhead for long, but arrives, covers the entry, and disappears before attention gathers. High above Venezuela, F-35 aircraft moved into position without visible warning. Their presence was designed to remain unseen, not to announce power, and every movement focused on denying the enemy awareness rather than engaging in prolonged combat. These jets targeted key air defense nodes that controlled detection rather than firepower, striking the eyes of the system instead of its fists. Radar sites that commonly tracked movement across vast distances suddenly lost clarity, while communication links between sensors began to fracture. The effect was not dramatic in appearance, but it was decisive in outcome. Radar operators experienced gaps and distortions rather than a total shutdown, creating hesitation rather than an immediate alarm. Air defense units struggled to distinguish real signals from electronic noise, and this uncertainty slowed reaction times at the exact moment speed mattered most. Surveillance drones that had once provided a steady picture of the airspace were briefly blinded or forced to rely on degraded feeds. This disruption was temporary by design. The objective was not to permanently damage the Venezuelan air defense network, but to disorient it long enough to create a safe passage. By avoiding sustained strikes, the operation reduced the chance of escalation or a broader military response. The sky did not erupt into open battle, and there were no waves of aircraft circling overhead, only a sudden loss of certainty among defenders. Within this narrow window, The second and most dangerous phase began. Delta Force helicopters flew toward Caracas at low altitude, adopting a profile designed to blend in with the urban environment. The aircraft hugged terrain and structures, staying below traditional radar coverage while relying on speed and timing. This approach mirrored tactics used in domestic raids against heavily armed gangs, where helicopters drop teams directly onto targets before ground resistance can organize. At 1:01 a.m. Eastern Time, the helicopters reached the outer approach to the city. Sirens or visible lights did not announce their arrival, and the crews maintained strict discipline to avoid drawing attention to themselves. Each aircraft followed a predetermined route designed to minimize exposure and reduce the chance of visual detection. The flight path was calculated minute by minute because even minor delays could allow air defenses to recover. As the helicopters closed in, teams inside prepared for immediate action. The equipment was rechecked, communication remained brief and controlled, and attention remained fixed on the next few seconds rather than the broader picture. This focus resembled moments before a high-risk warrant service in American cities, where officers know that hesitation can turn a controlled entry into chaos. The environment below was dense, complex, and unforgiving, leaving no room for error. Upon arrival at the target area, the helicopters did not linger. They delivered personnel and shifted position to provide limited cover while avoiding prolonged exposure. Security teams moved outward from the landing zone, establishing a protective perimeter that separated the objective from surrounding threats. This rapid control of space prevented outside interference, allowing the core team to focus entirely on the mission. The risk at this stage was extreme because any misstep could trigger a firefight or draw attention from nearby units, yet the operation relied on restraint as much as it did on force. Rather than overwhelming the area with firepower, the teams emphasized control, positioning, and speed. This approach reduced noise and confusion, keeping the situation contained within a tight geographic space. Inside the secured area, movement was fast and deliberate. Team members coordinated silently, guiding one another through their predetermined roles. The objective was reached without hesitation, and physical control was established immediately. The presence of both the primary target and his spouse had been anticipated, and procedures focused on safety and stability rather than intimidation. Throughout this phase, the absence of large-scale combat remained intentional. There were no extended exchanges, and no attempt was made to push beyond the immediate objective. The mission demanded precision, not spectacle, and the teams operated under strict limits designed to prevent escalation. By the time nearby elements could react, the critical actions had already been completed. Extraction followed almost as quickly as arrival. Helicopters returned to collect the teams, and the protective perimeter collapsed inward as the operation shifted from control to departure. This transition mirrored the end of successful gang raids in American cities, where officers withdraw before crowds gather or rumors spread. Speed, once again, served as the primary defense. As the helicopters lifted away from Caracas, the temporary air corridor closed behind them. Air defense systems began to recover, radar clarity improved, and surveillance feeds returned, but the opportunity had passed. The window that had allowed the operation to succeed was gone, leaving defenders to piece together events after the fact rather than during them. The importance of this sequence lies in its restraint. The operation demonstrated that modern air power does not always seek dominance, but sometimes aims only to create opportunity. By limiting the duration and scope of the air actions, planners reduced political and military fallout while achieving their objective. This approach reflected lessons learned from years of targeted operations rather than conventional warfare. For readers familiar with law enforcement pursuits, the parallels are clear. Just as helicopters and tactical teams coordinate during high-risk arrests to isolate and remove a single suspect, this operation utilized air power to isolate and remove a single figure from a fortified environment. The scale differed, but the logic remained the same. As attention turned outward in the hours that followed, the significance of the air corridor became clearer. Without it, the helicopters could not have reached their destination, and without speed, the operation would have stalled. The success of the mission rested on a few critical minutes when the sky itself became uncertain. This phase ended with the target under control and moving away from the city. Still, it also set the stage for the subsequent development where the focus shifted from seizure to extraction, and the role of naval forces waiting beyond the horizon became decisive. Speed ultimately determined the outcome, as once the helicopters lifted away from Caracas, the operation entered a race against time. At 3:29 a.m. Eastern Time, the force carrying the detainees crossed beyond Venezuelan airspace, and that moment marked the end of the most dangerous phase. There was no pause and no celebration, only continuous movement designed to stay ahead of confusion and retaliation. The aircraft followed pre-planned routes that avoided populated corridors and known surveillance zones. Every mile gained reduced the chance of pursuit. Inside the helicopters, control remained firm and methodical. Restraints were checked, positions were maintained, and communication stayed brief. The atmosphere resembled the final moments of a high-risk prisoner transfer in the United States, where officers focus on procedure rather than emotion. Each movement was deliberate because even minor lapses could change the balance. The objective was not comfort, but security, and the priority remained keeping the detainees stable and contained. As the aircraft moved farther from land, the environment shifted. Urban density gave way to open water, and with it came a different form of protection. Over the Caribbean, the risk of interference dropped sharply, and naval assets began to dominate the space. Sensors from American ships extended coverage, creating a protective envelope around the flight path. The sense of urgency did not disappear, but it became more controlled, shaped by layers of support rather than isolation. Arrival at the naval staging area occurred within minutes, reinforcing the importance of speed in modern operations. The detainees were transferred to an American warship positioned to receive them without delay. This handoff mirrored the efficiency seen when federal teams moved captured gang leaders from remote locations to secure facilities. The process was swift, precise, and tightly managed to prevent exposure or confusion. Once aboard the ship, procedures shifted from capture to custody. Medical assessments were conducted, identification was verified, and legal protocols were prepared. These steps were not symbolic, but practical, designed to ensure that the transition from battlefield seizure to judicial process remained unbroken. The presence of naval personnel added another layer of security, reducing the likelihood of interference from outside actors. The next phase unfolded rapidly, with preparations for transport to the United States already underway. Aircraft and logistics teams coordinated to move the detainees toward New York, where federal courts awaited. This transition reflected the broader strategy of treating the operation not as an act of conquest, but as an extension of law enforcement on an international scale. The emphasis remained on accountability rather than punishment. At 4:21 a.m. Eastern Time, public awareness finally caught up with events that had already concluded. A message appeared on social media announcing the capture, and the timing was deliberate. By the time the news reached a global audience, the detainees were beyond reach, secured by distance and layers of protection. This controlled release of information mirrored tactics used in domestic raids, where announcements follow arrests to avoid interference. Soon after, a formal press conference assembled key figures responsible for national security. The presence of senior defense, diplomatic, and intelligence officials signaled coordination at the highest levels of government. Their appearance underscored that the operation was not an isolated action, but the result of deliberate planning across multiple agencies. The message conveyed stability rather than triumph, emphasizing order over spectacle. In Venezuela, uncertainty spread quickly. The absence of clear information about the president's whereabouts created a vacuum that demanded an immediate response. Senior officials acknowledged the lack of contact, and the judicial system moved to appoint interim leadership. This transition occurred under pressure, as institutions attempted to maintain continuity in the face of sudden disruption. Reactions extended beyond government buildings. In Miami, members of the Venezuelan diaspora gathered to celebrate, viewing the capture as a turning point after years of frustration. The scenes echoed reactions seen after the foremost gang leaders are arrested in American cities, where communities respond with relief and emotion. These public expressions highlighted the human dimension of a geopolitical event. Elsewhere, responses carried a darker tone. Cuban authorities announced casualties among personnel stationed in Venezuela, framing the operation as an act of aggression. This reaction reflected the regional complexity surrounding the event, where alliances and rivalries intersected. The announcement added weight to international concerns and amplified calls for explanation. At the global level, the United Nations convened an emergency session. Representatives from various countries voiced objections, concerns, and demands for clarification. The debate revealed divisions over sovereignty, intervention, and accountability. While some criticized the action, others focused on the charges that awaited the detainees in American courts. As these discussions unfolded, the detainees continued their journey toward New York. Upon arrival, they were transferred under heavy security to face federal prosecution. Images of the handoff reinforced the narrative shift from battlefield operation to judicial process. The emphasis moved from tactics to law, from secrecy to procedure. The immediate aftermath demonstrated how quickly a single operation could ripple across political, social, and diplomatic spheres. What began as a race against time ended as a global conversation about power and responsibility. The speed that defined the extraction also defined the response, leaving little room for gradual adjustment. This phase of the story closes with the operation complete and its consequences unfolding, setting the stage for a deeper examination of what this moment means for regional stability and future confrontations that may follow. This operation did not resemble a full-scale war, and it never aimed to occupy territory, destroy cities, or wear down an enemy through prolonged fighting. What unfolded instead was a precise strike, built to end before the world fully understood it had begun, and designed to remove a single center of power rather than confront an entire nation. There were no long front lines, no mass deployments, and no extended clashes, because the objective was never conquest. The success of the operation rested on timing, coordination, and restraint, not on overwhelming destruction. At its core, this was a carefully balanced action that combined multiple layers of American power into one narrow window. Intelligence agencies shaped the battlefield long before the first aircraft took to the air, employing mapping routines, predicting behavior, and identifying moments of vulnerability with the same patience that characterized lengthy federal investigations into cartel networks. Air power did not seek dominance for its own sake, but instead created brief confusion, blinding and delaying defenses just long enough for movement on the ground. Naval forces waited quietly beyond the horizon, providing depth, security, and an exit that guaranteed the operation could end as quickly as it began. Special forces then carried the weight of the mission itself, moving with speed and discipline, focused on control rather than spectacle. Each element depended on the others, and none could have succeeded alone. Intelligence without air access would have stalled. Air power without ground action would have achieved nothing lasting. Special forces without naval support would have faced unacceptable risk. Together, they formed a system designed for one purpose only: decisive action within minutes, followed by immediate withdrawal. This integration reflects a model that has been refined through years of counterterrorism operations and high-value arrests, where the goal is not to fight endlessly, but to end a threat cleanly and quickly. Looking forward, this raises a deeper question about how conflict may unfold in the future. If this model continues, the idea of a safe and stable space for national leaders becomes increasingly fragile. Power no longer guarantees protection, and visibility may invite vulnerability rather than safety. Leaders who once relied on distance, bureaucracy, or political inertia may find that these shields offer less protection than before. In such an environment, decisive action can occur long before public debate or diplomatic pressure has a chance to develop. This also suggests that modern conflicts may increasingly occur before public awareness. Decisions are made quietly, movements happen at night, and outcomes are revealed only after they are already irreversible. By the time citizens begin to argue, protest, or celebrate, the critical moments have already passed. War, in this sense, becomes something felt through announcements and images rather than experienced in real time, reshaping how societies understand power and accountability. For supporters of firm security policies, this approach represents strength through control and discipline, thereby avoiding the chaos and costs associated with prolonged wars. For critics, it raises concerns about precedent and escalation, especially when actions cross borders and blur the line between military force and law enforcement. Both views highlight the same reality. The tools of power are changing, and their use is becoming faster, quieter, and more precise. If you want to keep following how modern conflicts, covert operations, and high-risk pursuits are reshaping global politics, subscribe to Military Power for more deep dives into the battles and arrests that rarely unfold in plain sight. And now, the question remains open for you to consider and discuss. Does this kind of operation help stabilize order by removing dangerous centers of power quickly? Or does it create a dangerous precedent that could redefine conflict in ways the world is not prepared for?